January 5th, 1943, the waters off Guadalcanal. A lone Japanese dive bomber, a Val, cuts across the sky. On the deck of the light cruiser USS Helena, the 5-inch guns answer, sending shells climbing into the humid air. Black puffs of flak blossom against the blue, one, then another. Both are clean misses. The gunners can see it. The shells detonated too far behind, too far below. It's a shot they've seen fail 1,000 times. But then, something impossible happens. With no direct hit, no visible impact, the Japanese plane is violently torn apart, disintegrating into a fireball before plunging into the Pacific. On the Helena's deck, the gun crew stands silent. They all saw it. It was a miss. The destruction of that plane was no miracle. It was the deliberate, planned result of one of the war's most guarded secrets. A technology with a security classification that rivaled the Manhattan Project. This was the culmination of a frantic scientific race to solve an impossible problem by building a miniature radio station, a tiny electronic brain rugged enough to survive the 20,000 G force of being fired from a cannon. The question is not simply what happened over Guadalcanal, but how? How do you make an artillery shell think? And to grasp the genius of the answer, we must first confront the sheer desperation of the problem. By 1940, for the men on the ground staring up at a hostile sky, the problem was one of impossible physics. Downing a modern bomber wasn't like shooting a rifle. It was a game of prediction, a desperate exercise in applied mathematics performed in seconds with the survival of a city or a ship on the line. The entire process was a complex mechanical ballet. A gun crew had to estimate the aircraft's altitude, speed, and heading. This data was fed into a director, a complex analog computer of gears and cams, which tried to calculate a point in space where the plane would be in the next 15 to 20 seconds. The gun was aimed at this empty patch of sky. But the most critical step came last. A gunner would use a wrench-like tool to manually set a tiny clockwork timer in the nose of the shell, the fuse. This timer would start ticking the moment the shell left the barrel. The hope was that after its long ballistic journey, the shell would arrive at the predicted point in space at the exact same instant as the aircraft, and the fuse would detonate. It almost never worked. A slight change in the wind, a minor jink by the pilot, a fractional error in the rangefinder's estimate, any of these rendered the entire calculation useless. The shell would explode in empty air, hundreds of feet from its target. Official studies from the period are sobering. During the Battle of Britain, British Antiaircraft Command fired tens of thousands of rounds a week. Their own internal analysis, confirmed by later reports, revealed the brutal odds. It took, on average, over 2,000 heavy anti-aircraft shells to bring down a single enemy plane. For the Royal Navy, defending its fleets from Stuka and torpedo attacks, the numbers were even more terrifying. A warship is a floating powder keg. One well-placed bomb could mean disaster. And for the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, watching the war in Europe and anticipating a conflict in the Pacific, this wasn't just a tactical problem. It was an existential threat to their entire carrier-centric doctrine. The math was clear and unforgiving. Improving the gears in the director or the powder in the shell casing would only offer marginal gains. The fundamental concept, firing a dumb, timed firework at a thinking, maneuvering target, was a losing strategy. The answer had to come from somewhere else entirely. The answer arrived in late 1940, not from an arsenal, but from a university campus. The idea, championed by physicist Merle Tuvey at the newly formed Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, was audacious. The fuse wouldn't be a timer, it would be a miniature radio station, broadcasting a continuous signal from the shell's nose. As it neared a target, the reflected wave would shift in frequency, the Doppler effect. That shift would trigger the explosion. The theory was elegant, the engineering was a nightmare. An artillery shell accelerates from 0 to nearly twice the speed of sound in a fraction of a second. The force is instantaneous, monumental, 20,000 times the force of gravity. Inside the fuse, the heart of the radio, was the vacuum tube, a fragile bulb of glass containing a delicate filament and grid, some no thicker than a human hair. Early tests were catastrophic. Prototypes fired into a sandbank were dug out, only to reveal a useless jumble of shattered glass and broken wires. The laws of physics were winning. The breakthrough came from engineers recruited from civilian companies like Sylvania and RCA. They didn't just strengthen the tube, they reimagined it. Using stronger glass, mounting the internal elements on tiny shock-absorbing pads, and reducing the entire assembly to the size of a thimble, they created a ruggedized tube. In tests, it worked. The delicate electronics survived the brutal launch. They had proven the impossible was possible. A scientific miracle born in a laboratory. But now came the real war. Could this fragile instrument be mass-produced by the millions? And could its very existence be kept a total secret? The project was given a deliberately misleading name, VT Fuze, for variable time. The name was a piece of misdirection, a lie designed to make any captured document suggest a simple improvement to a clockwork timer. The reality was a national undertaking of immense scale. By 1944, the VT Fuze program would employ over 100,000 people across more than 800 contractors and research facilities. In terms of cost and complexity, it was second only to the Manhattan Project. The device itself was a marvel of miniaturization. As the shell spun through the air, a tiny radio transmitter in its nose cone emitted a continuous, cone-shaped beam of radio waves. The fuse was, in effect, listening. When the shell passed within roughly 75 feet of an aircraft, the radio waves would bounce off the metal skin and reflect back to a receiver in the fuse. Because the shell was closing in on the target, the frequency of these returning waves was slightly higher, the same Doppler effect that changes the pitch of a passing train whistle. A simple amplifier circuit, no bigger than a matchbook, was designed to detect this specific frequency shift. When it did, it closed a switch, triggering the detonator. The shell would then erupt into a precisely timed, lethal cloud of shrapnel, exactly where it would do the most damage, without ever needing to score a direct hit. But this incredible power came with an equally incredible risk. The greatest fear was not that the fuse would fail, but that it would work perfectly and then fall, unexploded, into enemy hands. A single dud recovered from a battlefield in Europe or a crash site in China could be reverse-engineered. If Germany or Japan could replicate the technology, the Allies' decisive advantage would vanish overnight. The fear was so profound that in March of 1942, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff issued one of the most restrictive orders of the war. The VT fuse was forbidden from being used over land or anywhere a dud might be recovered by the enemy. It was to be used only over water, where any malfunctioning shell and its secrets would be safely buried beneath the waves. This single top-secret directive would dictate the entire initial course of the weapon's deployment. Its first battlefield would not be the skies over Germany, but the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Following the USS Helena's stunning success on January 5, 1943, the fuses began to flow to the fleet. The shipments were discreet, the instructions classified. Gunners were told little about how the new fuses worked, only that they worked. And the results were immediate and undeniable. Before the VT fuse, a Navy 5-inch gun crew was considered effective if they could down a plane with 1,000 to 2,000 rounds. It was a war of attrition, filling the sky with steel and hoping for a lucky hit. With the new fuses, the statistics changed almost overnight. In the latter half of 1943, reports from ships armed with the weapon showed the average number of rounds per kill plummeting. In some engagements, it dropped below 400. Later, during the Marianas Campaign in 1944, the defensive screens of Task Force 58, equipped with thousands of the new shells, became nearly impenetrable walls of fire. The probability of a kill had been multiplied, turning what was once a desperate defense into a lethal certainty. From the other side, the view was one of incomprehensible terror. For the Japanese pilots pressing their attacks against the American fleets, the sky had become a different, more hostile place. We can see their confusion in the few surviving after-action reports and pilot testimonies. They describe seeing friendly aircraft, wingmen they had flown with for months, suddenly and violently disintegrating in midair. There was no visible trail of a direct hit, just the distant black puff of an American anti-aircraft shell, seemingly a clean miss. Then, a moment later, the plane next to them would be ripped apart. They had no framework to understand what was happening. They reported that the Americans must have developed a new, impossibly powerful explosive, or that their gunners possessed some kind of supernatural luck. The idea that every single 5-inch shell streaking towards them contained its own miniature radar system was simply not conceivable. It was a leap in technology so profound that it defied their imagination. And because they could not understand the threat, they could not adapt their tactics to counter it. The secret was holding. At sea, the Fuze was changing the calculus of naval warfare, one shattered aircraft at a time. But halfway across the world, a new threat was rising over Europe, a crude, indiscriminate weapon that flew not with a pilot, but with a pulse jet engine and a ton of explosives. A weapon that would force Allied command to make a terrible gamble and risk their most valuable secret to defend the streets of London. In June of 1944, that new threat arrived with a terrifying, sputtering roar, the V-1 flying bomb. To the scientists who designed the proximity fuse, the V-1 was, ironically, the perfect target, pilotless, non-maneuvering, flying a straight and level course. But for the Allied High Command, it presented an agonizing dilemma. The Joint Chiefs order was absolute. The fuse was for use over water only. A fierce, high-stakes debate erupted. The British War Cabinet, watching London burn, pleaded for the weapon. Conventional anti-aircraft batteries were struggling, and the psychological toll of the buzz bombs was immense. But General Eisenhower and the American command staff pushed back, hard. The strategic risk was unacceptable. If a single unexploded fuse fell into German hands, the secret that was decimating Japanese air power in the Pacific would be lost. The Allies' own bomber fleets might soon face a similar technology over the Reich. It was a brutal calculation: protect a city or protect a war-winning secret. As the V-1 attacks intensified, the pressure from Churchill's government became overwhelming. The gamble was made. In July 1944, the order was finally given. The fuses were released for use over land. The secret was coming ashore. On December 16, 1944, the German army launched its last great offensive of the war in the West. As panzer divisions smashed through the Ardennes forest, their advance depended on one critical factor: weather. A thick, persistent blanket of cloud and fog grounded the overwhelming power of Allied aviation. But on Christmas Eve, the skies began to clear. The Allied air forces returned with a vengeance. In a final, desperate gamble to regain control of the air, the Luftwaffe prepared Operation Bodenplatte. On New Year's Day, 1945, over 900 German fighters roared into the sky. Their target? The Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. Their pilots were briefed to expect the usual inaccurate, time-fused flak. They flew into a trap. The anti-aircraft batteries defending the critical bridges at Antwerp and other key points were now armed with thousands of proximity fuses, the same shells that had just defeated the V-1. As the German fighters screamed in at low altitude, the sky did not just fill with scattered black puffs. It erupted. A wall of perfectly timed, lethally precise explosions tore the Luftwaffe formations apart. Pilots who thought they had evaded a burst found their aircraft shredded by an unseen force. In a single morning, the Luftwaffe lost over 200 pilots, many of them irreplaceable veterans. They had been sent on a mission against 1942-era defenses and were annihilated by a 1945-era weapon they never knew existed. The secret was out, but its work was done. And so we return to the deck of the USS Helena and the impossible kill on January 5, 1943. That lone Japanese bomber was not the victim of a lucky shot. It was the first combat casualty of a revolution, one fought not with steel, but with vacuum tubes and radio waves. The final statistics are staggering. The fuse made a gun battery at least 3 times more lethal against a maneuvering aircraft. Against the V-1 flying bomb, it increased the kill probability from near zero to almost 80% in the final weeks of the campaign. This was the weapon that saved thousands of sailors from the kamikaze onslaught and thousands of civilians in European cities. It proved that victory in the Second World War was not simply a matter of courage or industrial scale. It was a contest of applied science, the first true smart weapon, a piece of electronic intelligence packed into 4 pounds of steel. It was a weapon that helped define the future of conflict. In the final analysis, the war's most transformative secret weapon wasn't the bomb that could destroy a city. It was the miniature electronic brain, forged in secrecy, that for the first time taught a simple piece of flying steel how to see.